Dear colleagues, let me welcome you. Let's start the meeting of the Dissertation Council. Our subject today is the thesis by Valerii Pugachev, submitted for the degree of Candidate of Legal Sciences, Specialty 120001, and the subject theme of the thesis is Conceptual Foundations of the Legal Political Doctrine of Critical Analysis. Our Dissertation Council was established by the order of the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg University on the 21st of October 2019, and let me introduce the members of the Council. Genevieva Igorevna Rukovskaya, Doctor of Law, Professor, Head of the St. Petersburg University, and in the remote mode we have Leonid Rudolfovich Sukyanin, Doctor of Law, Professor of the Higher School of Economics, and Sergei Fedorovich Udartsev, Doctor of Law, Professor, KazGU of Kazakhstan. And one more member of the Dissertation Council, Igor Andreevich Isayev, Doctor of Law, Professor of Moscow State Legal University, named Kutafin, is absent for a good reason, and I am the chairman of the Dissertation Council, Elena Vladimirovna Timoshina, Professor of St. Petersburg University. And let me emphasize that according to the federal law on science and the state scientific and technical policy, St. Petersburg University has the right to award academic degrees independently. The corresponding order on awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University was issued on the 1st of September 2016, and on the basis of this order we are holding our meeting. Well, in accordance with this order, a meeting of the Dissertation Council shall be deemed competent if at least 2/3 of its approved members are present. Our Dissertation Council consists of 5 members. 4 members are present, including 2 in remote mode, so we have the quorum and we may start our work. A certain procedure has been recommended to us. So, Valerii Vladimirovich, you will have 15 minutes for a summary of the key points of your thesis, speeches of the Dissertation Council, which they would also stick to the limits. First item shall be my summary report on the documents submitted by Valerii Vladimirovich. I would like to save this time for our scientific discussion, so all the documents required have been submitted. An application to the rector, list of publications, a review by the academic supervisor, and other documents which give Valerii Vladimirovich the right for his thesis to be presented to this Dissertation Council. So I will not waste our time, and I will give the floor to Valerii Vladimirovich for his presentation. Dear colleagues and dear members of the Dissertation Council, dear guests, today I'd like to present to you my thesis, Conceptual Foundations of Legal Political Doctrine of Critical Analysis, dedicated to the study of political legalism, one of the most important Islamic ideologies of the 20th century. First of all, I'd like to say a few words about the relevance of the chosen topic. At the beginning of the 21st century, Islam finally came to the forefront of world politics, and Islamic political legal thought began to have an increasing influence on the social development of Muslim countries. This fact demonstrates the urgent need for scientific reflection on key political and legal concepts and principles developed by Islamic political and legal thought at the current stage of its development. The political and legal teachings of Mawdudi could be described as an attempt to reconstruct and revise the most important theological and legal concepts of Sunni Islam, which include Jahiliyyah, Caliphate, and Tajid. These religious and legal concepts being developed by Sunni science between the 7th and the 14th centuries and were aimed at adapting the traditional Sunni Islam concepts on history, politics, law, and state to the changing social conditions as much as possible. At the same time, the main innovation introduced by Mawdudi into Islamic political and legal thought and constituting its main ideological heritage is the theory of divine domination, or the theory of Hakimiyya. The thesis study consists of an introduction, 3 chapters with 7 paragraphs, a conclusion, and a list of sources and literature used. Chapter of the thesis. I apologize. I have to apologize. Professor Sukiyanin is not with us. I am with you. Thank you, Leonid Rudolfovich. Then let us continue. The first paragraph of the first chapter of the dissertation deals with Mawdudi's teachings on Jahiliyyah. It's established that Jahiliyyah is a set of moral and ethical principles and values of pagan tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, historically understood by traditionalist Fakis and theologians as a purely cultural phenomenon, without any political and legal meaning, acquires a distinct political content in the teachings of Mawdudi. He defines Jahiliyyah as a politically constructed paganism and polytheism that manifests itself in the public life of the Muslim world as an Islamic ideologies, forms of government and political regimes. In this interpretation of Jahiliyyah, the Islamic state order takes on the meaning of the foundations of the faith, the renunciation of which equates Mawdudi with open disbelief with legal consequences, such as jihad. The second paragraph of the first chapter of my thesis deals with Mawdudi's teaching of Hakimiyya. According to the concept of Hakimiyya, the highest governing subject exercising legislative power in the Muslim community is an exclusively Allah, the principle as of joyful domination. The authority to legislate is exercised by Allah directly through the imperative precepts of the Quran and Sunnah Nas, as well as indirectly through recourse by a Muslim jurist to resources of ijtihad in order to establish the true content of the legal norm, which implies granting the Muslim community a limited right to legislate on matters not regulated by the imperative norms of the Quran and Sunnah, the so-called political domination or limited popular domination, which is exercised by the Caliph, a narrow circle of ideas. The political form of implementation of the Hakimiyya doctrine is the Islamic state or caliphate, in which the Muslim community enjoys the right of limited popular domination through representation exercised by the Caliph. The first paragraph of the second chapter of the thesis is devoted to Mawdudi's teaching about the sources of fiqh. It has been established that a distinctive feature of the Mawdudi doctrine is the doctrine of the alleged nature of the Sunnah legal precepts, the negation of the meaning of sources of law behind the hadith, the category of ahad, and the desire to ensure that the widest possible application of ijtihad, the legislative activity, is possible. Mawdudi's recognition of the importance of the source of law only behind the righteous caliphs effectively levels out its level in the system of sources of law, which in turn creates room for individual discretion in the formulation of the legal norm. At the same time, the non-recognition of Mazhabism leads to the incorporation of Maliki, Istisla, and Hanafi Istihsan into a single system of sources. In general, the doctrine of Usul al-Fiqh in Mawdudi's presentation is eclectic in nature and represents an attempt to scientifically systematize secondary rational sources of law and Maliki, Hanbali, and Hanafi origin. The second paragraph of the second chapter of the thesis is introductory and contains a brief description of the main classical and modernist teachings about the Sultanate and Caliphate. The third paragraph of the second chapter of the thesis is devoted to the concept of the Islamic State developed by Mawdudi. In contrast to the traditional view of Islamic governance as an exercise by individuals of the authority of the Prophet Muhammad as a high ruler in an Islamic state, the understanding of these governance as the caliphate of the Messenger of Allah, Mawdudi views the caliphate as a mechanism for implementing the principle of Hakimiyya theory, the caliphate of Allah. The Muslim community elects from among its surroundings a viceroy authorized to exercise the executive power on its behalf. Mawdudi insists on the need to recognize monarchy as a non-Islamic form of government on the grounds that the monarchical rule is incompatible with the principle of divine domination. Moreover, from Mawdudi's point of view, monarchy is a political form, expression of Jahiliyyah, and includes not only non-Islamic forms of government, but all non-Islamic political ideologies of Western origin. In the form of a state, the Caliphate of Mawdudi is a world Islamic republic with a theo-democratic political regime, which, despite the declared negative attitude of this scholar to theocratic governance, is actually understood as a totalitarian Islamic theocracy. And finally, chapter 3 of the thesis deals with Mawdudi's teachings on religious renewal and the Islamic Revolution. As a result of my analysis, it can be concluded that Mawdudi defines Tajid as the actual establishment of an Islamic state order on a global scale by means of which jihad ideologically framed the concept of Islamic revolution. Mawdudi's teachings on the Islamic revolution have gone through two successful stages in their development. At the first stage, the Islamic revolution was understood as an armed struggle. It's a classical doctrine of jihad aimed at eradicating social vice and forcibly overthrowing the state power. In the second stage, the Islamic revolution has been defined by Mawdudi as a non-violent confrontation with the state power, the so-called renewed doctrine of jihad. And its direct object is no longer the state, but an abstract set of Jahili political ideologies. In conclusion, the Salam as a state and system is an unacceptable religious innovation. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Valerii Vladimirovich, thank you. You have questions? Do members of the Dissertation Council have questions on the presentation of the applicant? Yes, I have a question, please. In your thesis, you inspect the influence of Mawdudi's doctrine on further development of Islamic political and legal thought. What's the practical significance of Mawdudi's ideas? Have they been practically applied in Pakistan or during his lifetime, or maybe in later periods? Thank you for your question. I believe that direct application of Mawdudi's teachings did not happen, but some examples can be given of some quasi-states which accepted some provisions of his doctrine. In 1969, professor of Kabul University, Niazi, established an organization called Islamic Plan, and this organization, which later fell into several political parties of Islamic nature, Madiyara, Islamic Party of Afghanistan, and about organization, Islamic Society, led by, in 1992, these parties and some other parties took over Kabul and established the so-called Mujahid government. And I believe the ideology of these short-lived governments, which existed between 1992 and 1994, in principle, partly is connected with Mawdudi's teachings, especially in the understanding of Hekimaya. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Dear colleagues, let me remind you of the opportunity that all the attendees have the opportunity to ask questions, but to do this you have to put your name in the registration sheet over there, and anyone present here has the opportunity to participate in our scientific discussion. Do we have more questions from the colleagues? If no one has more questions, I shall proceed to reading the external reviews sent. The first review was submitted by Nikolai Nikolaevich Dyakov, professor, head of Department of History of the Middle East, St. Petersburg University. The review is positive. It emphasizes relevance, well-thought structure, which corresponds to the objects of the study, and in the end, the reviewer makes two comments. First, according to Nikolai Nikolaevich, the thesis, somewhat superficially, reveals the influence of political and legal views of the representatives of the Muslim Brotherhood on the formation of the ideology of Mawdudi. The author did not pay enough attention to the question of relationship between the concept of renewal of religion by Mawdudi and corresponding ideas of the founder of the mentioned association, Hassan al-Banna. And the second comment suggested by Nikolai Nikolaevich, the applicant, in his opinion, unfortunately did not avoided such a significant aspect of biography of Mawdudi as his own experience of political activity, which can serve as an independent, important source of information about the revolution of political and legal beliefs of the scientists. However, the author believes that these two comments do not affect the overall assessment, positive assessment of the thesis, and the thesis meets the requirements, and the applicant Valerii Vladimirovich deserves the degree of candidate of. The second review was submitted by a Doctor of History, Professor of the Department of History of the Middle East of St. Petersburg University, Igor Vyacheslamovich Gerasimov. The review is positive, and the author also comments on relevance of the thesis. And the author also mentions that in order to write the thesis, the author had to develop a good command of Islamic studies, a legal system, and such good understanding of these two spheres. His thesis is quite obvious to every reader of the thesis, covered a great number, significant of Arabic language works by Muslim authors, and Valerii Vladimirovich managed to demonstrate the place of Mawdudi's teaching in the political and legal field of the modern Islamic world. And not really a suggestion, but more of a recommendation. According to the author of the review, the author should continue his research in this sphere, but pay attention to the need to unify the system of proper names, because this causes different interpretation and makes understanding the text difficult. And the reviewer wishes the applicant to continue his research in this sphere, and the general conclusion is that the thesis corresponds to applicable requirements, and the applicant deserves the degree of candidate of legal sciences. And I will also read the review by a member of the Dissertation Council who's absent from at our session today, member of our Dissertation Council. Since all the reviews have been published on the university website, I will allow myself to summarize the positive part of this review and focus on the critical comments. Igor Andreevich comments on a few studies of political concepts of political Islam, and in this regard, this study is rightly considered as the most very timely. Igor Andreevich comments that the choice of object and subject of the thesis is well justified and has been achieved successfully. The author, Igor Andreevich, also pays attention to the fact that the work by Valerii Vladimirovich is the first scientific study which contains a detailed legal analysis of Mawdudi's teaching about the Muslim law, and when assessing provisions set for defense, Dr. Risaevs says they are valid based on the original teachings translated by Mawdudi, translated into Arabic languages, which has not been introduced in the scientific circulation. These provisions are reliable, and the logical structure of the thesis is obvious. Igor Andreevich suggests to the thesis, to the author, two comments. He emphasizes that these are more of a discussion nature. Firstly, in the text of the dissertation of the thesis, repeatedly contains a number of specific Islamic terms, the content of the meaning of which has not properly disclosed by the author. In particular, this refers to Islamic socialism, by which, according to the author, Mawdudi understood some kind of communist ideology. Given the variety of forms that socialism historically took in the Middle East during the 20th century, the term mentioned above requires further clarification as to the meaning that Mawdudi put into it. And second comment, according to the reviewer, the author of the thesis did not fully reveal the role and significance of the Indian Caliphate movement in shaping Mawdudi's political and legal views, especially taking into account the fact that as the was abolished by the Turkish in 1924, this had a significant impact on Buddhist Islamic State. So, two comments. And then Igor Andreevich further concludes that the thesis corresponds to the necessary requirements, and Valerii Vladimirovich Pugachev deserves to be awarded the degree of candidate of legal sciences. So these were the two external reviews, and a review by a member of the Dissertation Council who is absent from today's meeting. And now let me give the to members of the Dissertation Council present. Adolfovich first. Thank you, Ms. Chairman. So it's your decision to give the floor to me. So let me present my opinion on Valerii Vladimirovich work. I would like to thank St. Petersburg University for inviting me to take part in this session of the Dissertation Council. This is my first experience, and I have very positive feelings each time I communicate with my colleagues from St. Petersburg University. I always get very positive feelings, so it's a pleasure for me to take part in your meeting, though we understand that these are great, important, significant dates for Leningrad, the end of the siege of Leningrad. That's an important event, and I especially wanted to mention that my grandmother and my mother, they spent their first winter of the siege in Leningrad, and that is why I'd like to share with all the citizens of Leningrad my feelings. Taking part in today's meeting for me gives me certain satisfaction, because I have a very positive opinion of the thesis. I believe this is an interesting work which has scientific relevance, and from a practical point is valuable. We all know that Islamic thought is very diverse. The study of legacy of views of Al-Mawdudi is very interesting and relevant. At the same time, it's necessary to understand that national science has very few studies in this field. Russian and Soviet theologians did study Mawdudi's legacy, but lawyers didn't do so. So this work is quite unique and special, and the contribution made by the author for the practical point, from the practical, Islam plays as a significant political and legal role, which I already mentioned, and it affects international relations, Russian foreign policy, Islamic world So we need to have clear understanding of the role played by Islam and how it impacts the legal development of Islamic countries. At that, in the role of Islam growing still plays a significant role, and in the past decades has been influencing the political and legal development in these countries more and more. The sound has changed somewhat. Can you hear me, dear colleagues? Can you hear me? I cannot hear you. So maybe I can hear you very well. We are using headphones. Okay, then I will continue. I think that the work is the theme is well selected, the structure is the work is very reasonable, which enabled the author to come to justified and clear conclusions. I will not focus on this and on contribution. Vladimir Valerii, I have already mentioned that in my review, and the applicant himself has already presented the key points of his thesis. I believe he managed to identify the most important point. He says conceptual foundations. He identifies such concepts as hekimaya, such a concept as such concepts as modern understanding of caliphate, Mawdudi's position to the sources of Shariat and fiqh. These are the conceptual foundations which the author identifies. And in the first chapter, most interesting, not so much about the concept of jahiliya, which is very important, but I would like to draw your attention, it was very interesting for me, to the analysis of hekimaya concept. But unlike Valerii Vladimirovich, I would translate not as domination or divine, but as omnipotence. But of course, divine domination. It can also be translated as divine domination. So, as important is how he explains this concept developed by Mawdudi, and I think his explanation is quite correct. Next, in second chapter of his work, the author examines in Mawdudi's views on law and the state. In this section, he speaks about his understanding of jihad, and one important point made by the author, quite correctly, is that Mawdudi's attitude to fiqh and jihad is quite eclectical. And this emphasizes this second part, the critical analysis of Mawdudi's views. Valerii Vladimirovich is not 100% supporter of Mawdudi's views, to which he gives critical assessment. He accepts some of his points, so it's good that sometimes he contradicts. He emphasizes contradictions between Mawdudi's views, and the fact that jihad and other concepts connected with fiqh take part in Hanafi, Shahid, and other authors is quite justified, and that means that Mawdudi took the path, tried to unite several approaches, which is quite typical to modern approach to Sharia and fiqh. Was one of the first, Mawdudi was one of the first men to do that in the 21st century, and it's good that Valerii Vladimirovich pays attention to that. In the last chapter, the author speaks about the concept of jihad and religion renewal, and I think here the author managed to identify also the key points The topic is well covered. Conceptual Foundations of Mawdudi's views, and a critical analysis is also given. And I believe there are some minor drawbacks, or maybe omissions, or maybe points for discussion. I will not talk about sources, which is the list of sources. I know Mawdudi's work quite well. In my computer I have a whole folder with his works, but such a long list of works which I found in Mr. Pugachev's thesis, I have never come across. I think he found every possible source, which is a real strong point of his work. Yet I think there's some minor weaknesses. First, this was already mentioned, and that means that together with the authors of other reviews, in official reviews, and the opponents, and opinion already given by Professor Isaev, so that means we are sharing the same opinion. Any reader, and many my colleagues in the members of the Dissertation Council, because our professional expertise, maybe not all of us know much about the personality of Mawdudi, and nothing about his political activities, about the role he played in the establishment of the state of Pakistan, and without that, it's more difficult. Mawdudi's views appear abstract, and if you compare his political activities, the author mentions some questions he addressed to the Pakistani government, and without that, it's hard to assess not only his personality as a thinker, but his views. I think it's hard to do that objectively, so that would be good. Second thing I would like to mention is it's good that Valerii Vladimirovich gives opinions. He's given opinions of other scientists who worked together with Mawdudi, and their critical opinions. But how do these views appear today as compared to contemporary concepts of Islamic law and state? So-called Arab Spring is the discussion of reviewing of caliphate concept is a possibility of so the discussion is very heated, including official bodies. Especially spoke on these points, on the possibility of restoring caliphate. So it would be interesting if the author gave opinions not only of Mawdudi's contemporaries, but also of look at the modern development of Islamic thought, and these are because they have their supporters and critics today. Many respected scholars actually mentioned by Valerii Vladimirovich, such as Karadavi, together with Al-Ghanouchi. They support the so-called civil state of Sharia orientation or Islamic orientation. So what's the concept of Islamic civil state, and how does it compare with Mawdudi's caliphate concept? Would be very interesting to see. I understand their work has certain limits, but I think such an inclusion will not be foreign. Would be very natural. And one more general comment. Hope I will stick to my limit. The author speaks a lot about law, legal norm, and Islamic rights. And of course, is dedicated to the law, but how the author uses the term law. What does it mean, law? How is the term applied? How it can be applied to Mawdudi's views. He dealt with Sharia and fiqh, and if that's incorrect, this should have been demonstrated. Why does the author call certain provisions of Sharia law as a Sharia legal norm? Is this a legal norm or a Sharia norm? Or are these two things the same? So such terms, let me give you some. Sharia legal norm, Sunnah legal prescriptions. So what are the legal prescriptions of Sunnah? How come they are legal? What turns them into legal? What turns them into legal prescriptions from religious? The theme of the thesis is different, I understand, but then maybe the author should explain application of jihad in legislative as a Norman lawmaker when is a Muslim state based on Sharia. He follows the path of Ijtihad, but the author doesn't. That's not what the author means, and that's not what Mawdudi meant. And divine domination as a source of legislation. I don't understand what that means. The law-making power of Allah. Allah has no legal making power. He's God. I'm being very critical because I would like to start a discussion here. So maybe I'm a little bit over-exaggerating. So I'd like to draw the author's attention to this aspect, the legal heritage of Mawdudi. Mawdudi doesn't have legal heritage. He has spiritual heritage. He was a thinker, not a lawyer. There's no legal heritage of Mawdudi. And once again, I praise the work very. My opinion of the work is very high, and I think the author has done an enormous work to study all the writings of Mawdudi, to summarize them in such a clear way, to study opinions of different authors. And the fact that I pay attention to these points means that I don't see any significant drawbacks in this thesis. So I'm paying attention to some points to which the author maybe should pay more attention. So what else? I'm not quite clear how the author, what are the opinions of characteristic his fundamentalist thinker. Then he says he was the predecessor of radicalism, Islamic. So what's the author's is here the ideologist of extremism or fundamentalism? Is also should be understood that these terms are not always synonymous in contemporary literature. And finally, there are some minor drawbacks which some of my colleagues could have omitted, because I am an expert on Arabic world, such as fiqh sources and not ijtihad verses. These are not sources of ijtihad. They are ijtihad in itself. So they are not sources of ijtihad. Arabic term maslak amr should not be translated as independent useful action, though this happens sometimes. What else can I say? Please pay attention. Totemias, spelled to the spelling of Totemias. So is it doubled? So, and by the way, there's one more name, Ghazale, not Khazali. Though, of course, all the Russian authors spell it as Khazali. But if you look at Fiqh encyclopedia published in Kuwait, there's a whole section on names as that Khazali should be spelt with tashdid, and al-Khalad. It means untie. But these are all very minor points, and I'm doing this to help Valerii Vladimirovich if he wants to turn this text into a book, a monograph, which I think would be a good idea, which I would support. So then he should make some corrections. But otherwise, this is a complete independent work to an important scientific issue which has not been previously studied by Russian scholars. All the main conclusions I support, and if I all my remarks and inaccuracies which I mentioned, this is my opinion, and there could be other opinions, and the author doesn't have to accept my criticism. In any case, I think this is a very good work and meets all the basic requirements applied to candidates' thesis, and especially in this specialty, and the author, Pugachev Valerii Vladimirovich, deserves the degree of candidate of legal sciences. After reading the work and writing my review, I was ready, and I'm still ready today to vote for this thesis, though voting will come later. Of course, the final assessment will depend on the reviews made by other members of the council and on the answers, but I'm positive that for some reason that I will not change my opinion. My opinion will remain the same, and I will vote for this work, and I'm also calling my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Leonid Rudolfovich, for your review. Voting shall be public. Also, I was not familiar with your procedure. Thank you, Leonid Rudolfovich. Then let me give the floor to Sergei Fedorovich Udartsev. Dear Yelena Vladimirovna, dear Generva Igorevna, dear Leonid Rudolfovich, first of all, and of course, dear colleagues, I can only see the chairman, but I know there will be other attendees. So, dear colleagues, dear author, I would like to thank you for the invitation to join this dissertation council and to review this very good work. I'd like to emphasize that taking part in this council and today's meeting is very interesting because classical Islamic law, Muslim legal thought, Leonid Rudolfovich, famous expert and a living legend, history of political and legal teachers, Generva Igorevna, with whom we have not unfortunately met before in person before today. As for I'm sorry that Igor Andreevich is not here, who in addition to being an outstanding scientist is also a very prominent modern thinker, and with many interesting discussions awaiting him in the future. As for the thesis, I would like to emphasize that is a very which shows profound understanding of the subject. The author has studied the legal and political heritage theory, legal political of Indo-Pakistan lawyer and theologian Al Mawdudi in this aspect, which has not been studied as such before. Well, the relevance of the topic is obvious because Islam has been studied, spreading fast, spread in Europe, not only traditionally Muslim. And this has been spreading fast where Christianity previously was a dominant religion. Increasing political role of Islam and Islamic countries in modern global processes. The ongoing attempts to create a major Islamic theocratic state oriented towards anti-Western values and totalitarian rule, using the ideas of the World Islamic Revolution, also multiply the relevance, not increase but multiply the relevance of this study. Well, novelty of the thesis is obvious, and since in my review I have characterized in detail provisions set for defense and my opinion, I'd like to summarize that all the provisions set forth for this are quite original and well grounded, and reconstruct the teachings of original teachings of Mawdudi and his relationship with the ideas of other prominent Muslim theorists of state and law. And many key provisions have been are covered by the author's publications, and in the points set for defense, I would like to pay attention to another point, another novelty feature, the study of Muslim political and legal ideology. Not be only making quick progress around the world recently, in recent 10 or 20 years, but suggesting, asking questions and asking solutions to some basic philosophical ideas upon a number of these issues the author touches, which is another strong point of the thesis. So on some important points I'd like to focus a little bit more and emphasize them maybe briefly. And how they are present in the thesis, is but human potential, supreme legislative power. The theory, no matter what you call it, no matter what term is used, the author uses the term divine domination, or supreme legislative power of Allah, as the way Mawdudi uses it according to the author. It's supreme domination. This is one of the theological options for interpreting and researching superhuman aspects of power and law, and the issues, the aspects and potential of nature, of which humankind is in the course of globalization, although this progress stops occasionally, and future super globalizational processes that will still take place. It's interesting on psychological aspects of Mawdudi's theory, and here I think the author should have taken a look at this important feature is present in the works of many Muslim theorists and resonates with the modern concepts of state and law of the 20th and 21st centuries, after the psychological theory of law and state have been developed. The modern theory of in-depth state, which try to summarize different interpretations about the foundations of state and law. Several attempts to explain these issues have been made. So maybe the deep state theories are trying to synthesize these approaches, and the Muslim theory, the theory of state and law, given by Mawdudi, give one of the version of in-depth understanding of the state as and its activity, which limits and guides social relationship, sacred foundations of religion, Islam, religious practices, and a system of religious and other bonds within a state. I think it's an interesting piece in the thesis. So it will be interesting if the author could study this in more detail. Is the Muslim version of fascist state, not Mawdudi, but Mashrika. It's interesting, especially in connection with some modern tendencies in development of the theory of practice of Islamic State. Mention this doctrine, though this doctrine ideas became popular in Germany and other countries. In the Russian immigrants community, the immigrant community. So this part these ideas can influence modern tendencies of regional or global idea of a Muslim state. So what's also is the thought of Mawdudi's opinions about the forms of state, his criticism of monarch as a variation of capitalism on limitations of the national state and transnationalism and limitless Islamic state. It can be a global state led by chosen by the governor of the will of all of the Muslim Ummah, as the author, as the applicant says in his thesis. And related to this is his criticism of nationalism as an obstacle to Muslim unity, as a substitute for the idol of the nation, for faith in Allah. And so I think if the author has ever has an opportunity in his future research to go into more depth on these points, these theoretical considerations, and to think them over, the theoretical issues of Muslim thought from the point of perspective of development of so that will be interesting, not only from historical point but from the point of modern theory of state and law, modern theories. And in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that, as well as in many other works characterized by novelty and works that touch upon serious and points which are open to discussion, some points in the thesis, so maybe they call for more thorough study. One of the main points here is the issue of relation between his teachings and of revolution, his understanding of forced revolution. The author touches upon this point, discusses this point in detail, but I still have some question. The author demonstrates that originally Mawdudi believed jihad was or Muslim revolution was recognized as a forced form of rule, and then his became a non-violent form of Islamic revolution. So in that, can the author give the final description of Mawdudi's teachings and the limits between these stages of processing the conscious the society from violent to non-violent, more so in today's dynamic world. All these processes can be not only vertical but also horizontal, and when in different conditions, in different situations, it would be necessary maybe to keep in mind that Mawdudi could have suggested different actions to be taken and not focusing on, and so maybe developing these contradictions, different works in this different situations. Should it be that the genre, its audience, its readers, followers, when Mawdudi says maybe very makes very strong statements, or maybe wider audience where he needs to make his message more neutral and make it acceptable for the wider audience. And the structure of jihad, considering its understanding in other works by Mawdudi, jihad became synonymous with the concept of war. So what's the opinion of the author? And which maybe does not exclude the possibility of situational use of Mawdudi's ideas. So perhaps this question could be solved by taking not literary but also archival sources, his correspondence with his supporters, politician, someone in his political religious circle, and memories of people who knew him personally and his students. Then maybe it would be possible to finalize this. And given the interest shown by the author to non-violent ideas of the Islamic Revolution, it would be interesting to consider them in a broader context of Mahatma Gandhi's ideas. Had certain influence on a region close to that of Mawdudi. I also agree with Leonid Rudolfovich that considering novelty and thoroughness of the thesis in after some finishing work will be interesting to some revision. Will be interesting to publish this work as a monograph with some revisions. And maybe in the future will be very interesting if the author continued his research in this field, because I think the relevance of his research will only grow in the future, in future decades. So it will be interesting, given some minor points, very subtle features, and it will be interesting to search and study materials in foreign archives contain manuscripts of Mawdudi and other prominent Muslim thinkers, including maybe his letters with his supporters, which have not been published before, which will give a very good portrait of the thinker. So that will be very important for complete assessment of his views and beliefs. In general, the thesis by Valerii Vladimirovich is an excellent independent study which addresses a relevant scientific work of studying Mawdudi's heritage and determining his place in the Muslim political thought of the 20th century. It fills in the gap existing in the history of political legal doctrines of the 20th century and meets the requirements applied at St. Petersburg University. This fully complies the requirements applied to candidate's thesis, and the applicant deserves the degree of candidate of legal sciences. And, thank you for your attention. Thank you, Sergei Fyodorovich, for your review. So now let me give the floor to Ginevra Igorevna. Dear colleagues, I am a little bit ashamed because the subject of the thesis is an Islamic political system, the interpretation of Mawdudi's, how Mawdudi's interpretation by Valerii Vladimirovich Pugachev. Valerii Vladimirovich Pugachev persuaded me that modern Sunni teachings cannot be properly interpreted without proper understanding of ideas expressed by Mawdudi in the Indian Pakistani philosopher. So this makes the work relevant. He managed, and well, he says about that. So obviously, so to leave, as I'm saying, obviously to leave some space for discussion. So he tried to answer challenges with his caliphate ideas, the universal political system in the center of which is the Islamic State. So, is this justified? I paid special attention not to repeat what has already been said, mentioned already, the number of chapters and paragraphs. I was particularly interested in Mawdudi's teachings about the sources of law, which is very interesting because this is quite new compared, because I mostly touched upon this theme when teaching the sources of Muslim law. So in this, as for ijtihad, even though there are some inaccuracies in the work, which have already been mentioned in the very way the term is used, that without stopping on the structure and the content, I would like to emphasize again how the thesis is that we are discussing from many by substantial literature and translation of English original sources, and as made of small pieces of information, this interpretation of Mawdudi's teachings is made by the author. Speaking of novelty, so that's where the novelty is in a reconstruction of the key points of political teachings of Mawdudi, and not only in reconstruction but also, as was already mentioned, by critical analysis, by their critical analysis. So what are the tasks? The tasks have been listed in the introduction, so the author managed to solve them, so I will not expand on this. So I will focus on points that could be clarified, or maybe where something could be added. So first, in the sources, let me wish Valerii Vladimirovich to make this section longer and pay attention not only separately to Sunni and Shini teachings on the sources of law, but on how they are connected to the theory of religious renewal. That's because Valerii Vladimirovich to justify, he says in the beginning that he will not deal with this relation between the teachings of Sunni and Shiite teachings on Muslim law. But then in the text itself, in the broad sense, not only the thesis, the text in the wide sense of Muslim teachings calls for this, because Mawdudi there has some Shiite elements quite significant, for which he was criticized by Sunni lawyers, and in that case it makes sense to dwell more on this point. And secondly, maybe this is some sort of inaccuracy, because Asabiya is a symbol of is an Islamic principle. How can become the foundation of Hakimiyya? How can it become the foundation of Hakimiyya? It cannot. So that is one of the provisions put for defense. So the wording here is not good, especially in the context of Mawdudi's discussion with Ibn Khaldun. So in your when responding to my comments, I would like Valery Vladimirovich to touch upon these points. And in conclusion, I can only add, I'm delighted to join my colleagues and their recommendation that Valery Vladimirovich, as a doctoral student, the Department of History of the Middle East, as a master's student, a doctoral student, who has always been a very good, diligent student. His work corresponds to all the requirements. So I believe that Pugachev Valery Vladimirovich deserves the degree of candidate of legal sciences, specialty 120001. Thank you. Thank you, Ginevra Igorevna. And in conclusion, I will present my review. I enjoyed reading this thesis very much, with big touches. Valery Vladimirovich managed to write a brief yet comprehensive history of Islamic legal thought, of its key concepts. And today my colleagues have already mentioned relevance of the thesis. The relevance is obvious, because the author focuses on Islam, which, as he says, has been reduced to a political ideology and a political system. And it seemed to me, it was interesting to me, I think that at least me personally, when reading about Mawdudi's ideas, I related them, compared them to European ideas, and Mawdudi's ideas appear paradoxical, but only at the first glance. It's a combination of modernism, and he reaches outside the tradition. He is not conservative in the European sense, and not always, but he suggests to rely on facilities of an individual, of the individual mind. So that interesting idea which leads to fundamentalism, for me that was a very interesting line of your research. So I certainly support my respected colleagues and all the positive opinions they have already given, and I will give some comments, but first I would like to emphasize that these are points for discussion, and well, I think they demonstrate the interest that your work arouses. Leonid Rudolfovich has already said that this lack of historical details, and I also missed these historical details as an example, as a drawback of so you mentioned that previous studies are dedicated to historical context in which a scientific and political activity of Mawdudi took place, and the distinct feature of your research is an attempt to investigate the legal heritage of Mawdudi, taking into account the historical patterns of development of Islamic teachings. So this is wonderful, but that should not lead to omission, losing focus on the historical context, including relevant details of political activity, for example, his political activity. So this drawback of historical details made it more difficult to see historical patterns which you promised to identify. I missed an answer why it became popular, what Mawdudi's teachings possible. Relying on the opinion of other researchers, says that his predecessors did not believe in the possibility of setting the question to renew caliphate and Islamic revolution. You say that even such a question was impossible. So then why exactly at that point it became this question, what made this question possible? And this the establishing of world caliphate and Islamic revolution, why this, what made this idea possible? How did this tendency started, as which was expressed by Mawdudi? Was this a consequence of, using your term, was this consequence of a historical pattern of development of Islamic teachings? Does that mean that something in Islam itself nourishes such ideas, what you call bringing down Islam to political ideology? Or did this happen and Islam turned into a political system because of particular historical circumstances which you did not mention in your thesis in detail? So why from the idea of divine domination was transformed into the idea of political domination? My second question is the concept of theodemocracy, or republican form of government. You draw attention to the contradictions of the Mawdudi's concept of democracy. On the one hand, is a part of jihilaya principles, is a essential element, and against this, jihad is pointed, and on the other hand, divine rule where Muslims endowed with limited popular domination, as you say. So how can it be explained, the origin of this contradiction? How can it be explained, which is obvious and which could hardly be overlooked by Mawdudi himself? why, at the cost of contradicting his own ideas, he seeks to justify the democratic character of political regime in an Islamic state. The explanations of this contradiction, to me, do not appear convincing to me. Because of that, I have a question. Don't you think that the idea of democracy, which Mawdudi advocates because its political significance turned out to be much bigger than contradiction with his own ideas? Maybe there is some connection with this apology of democratic regime, which could appears to be hardly come with his theological ideas, the idea of Islamic revolution. Because, of course, for a revolution, you need popular power, which becomes excited by the idea of domination, limited to some emir, but still. And the same question can be applied to Republican government, and it remains unclear what in this form of government suggested by Mawdudi is Republican, if all the branches of power shall remain in the hands of the Caliph. My third comment has already been mentioned by Sergei Fedorovich, is about the understanding or explanation of jihad. You mentioned two stages in the evolution of his ideas. So started with non-violent Islamic revolution, or so on the opposite. First it was violent and then non-violent revolution. But I think that Sergei Fedorovich very justly pointed at possible use of these different use of this concept in different situations. But to me, it's still unclear. It remains unclear if jihad could be non-violent. Then a question comes: how will Tajdid be achieved? The actual establishment of an Islamic state order on a global scale, where non-Muslims will be deprived of all political rights. And I have some doubts about the idea of kinesis of Islamic revolution, and it's been linked to Marxist-Leninist concept of. I will not comment on this, but I think there is some contradiction, because you say that even in the final stage of its development, page 119, that even in the final stage, the jihad idea still provides for armed nature. And my last comment is explained by the great interest caused by the paragraph dedicated to interpretation of Islamic legal doctrine. You say that Mawdudi distinguished two parts in Sharia. One is unchanged, is a kind of a frame, and the second is variable and can apply to the meet of increase in demands of time. I was very surprised by this sentence. What surprised me is that exactly the same wording we come across in the resolutions of European Human Rights Court, that the convention should be adjusted according to the contemporary requirements. Such evolutionary doctrine, maybe the same objective of reviewing some Sharia norms was pursued by Mawdudi. You making reference, he breaks out of tradition with a religious point of view, changes interpretation of pragmatic purposes of his political program. Mawdudi fully relied on not on the tradition but on his own mind. But then the question arises. So I'd like you to comment, to explain. So you say that in contrast to the modernist approach, through his appeal to the idea of implicit rationalism of the Quran, Mawdudi sought to justify his deeply atavistic, fundamentalist view of the Quranic norm. So on the one hand, this seems to be fundamentalism derives from modernism, and on the other hand, you say that he does that in contradiction to the modernist approach. So this is unclear. So so he believes that interpretation should be made on the basis of capacities of the individual mind. So these are all my comments, and I would like to I'm delighted to join the opinion, delighted to share the opinion of my colleagues that the thesis by Valerii Vladimirovich is a very thorough work, of very high quality, which meets all the applicable requirements, and Valerii Vladimirovich deserves the degree of candidate of legal sciences. Thank you. And Valerii Vladimirovich, you have the floor now, the opportunity to answer comments of the members of the Dissertation Council. So please remember the time limit, please. I thank the Council for their reviews, the Council members for their reviews. I will start commenting in the order the reviews have been presented. We'll start the review by Nikolai Nikolaevich Dyakov. As for the first comment, indeed, I did not specifically study the views. I did not, so that was my mistake in my work. I analyze the ideologies of Muslim Brotherhood in relation to Mawdudi's concept Hakimiyya, and that's why I focused on analysis of second Hassan al-Hudabi. It was called Vizenia and Vizna, but in essence the following should be a distinctive feature of teaching of Hassan al-Banna about the Tajid and Muslim revolution was first the idea of exceptional role of Egypt in the coming Islamic revival. I will quote a prominent researcher of Richard Mitchell. According to al-Banna, the role of Egypt is unique because since the reform of the Egyptian statehood begins with Islam, a revival of international Islam in both ideal historical sense requires first and a strong Islamic state. Another important difference between the concepts of revival of Islam proposed by Mawdudi and al-Banna is the latter's belief that Islam protects the principle of nationality. I will quote again, this time Hassan al-Banna: Islam is faith and ritual, nation and nationality, religion and state, spirit and action, sacred text and sword. Quran considers all this the core of Islam and its essence. And in principle, a number of researchers agree that a positive attitude of Al-Banna attitude to Islamic nationalism, unlike Mawdudi. This is my answer to the first comment. As for comment expressed by several reviewers about the lack of coverage in my thesis of political activities of Mawdudi, just give me a second. In my work, I deliberately did not pay much question to his political activity. So and there are several reasons for this, why I made this decision. First of all, as I mentioned in the introduction, political Mawdudi is quite well studied. In my opinion, the most detailed and profound biographer could be considered the Pakistani scientist Masood Al-Hassan, author of a 2-volume study, Abul A la Mawdudi and His Thought, published in 1984. An important group of biographical essays also includes works by supporters of Jamaat al-Islami party, which includes books by Sayyid Asad Gilani, Alif al-Din al-Turabi, and Sarwat Saulat. And finally, Mawdudi's political activity has been studied in detail in the works of several American authors, where we should mention a very detailed study by Syed Wali Reza Nasser and Roy Jackson. Accordingly, since the direct political activity of Mawdudi seems to me to be sufficiently studied, I believe that its detailed description in a legal study would be redundant. And secondly, it seems to me that Mawdudi's political activities may not always be the source of information about his political views, primarily due to the fact that throughout his life, this scholar had different, sometimes controversial views on the same issues. Examples include initial rejection of Pakistan before 1947 and later, and his role in the events that led to the pogroms of the Ahmadiyya sect in Lahore in 1953. So he did not appear as a supporter of ideas of non-violence that he presented in his writings. So this is briefly my answer to the comment of Nikolai Nikolaevich Dyakov. Next comment to Igor Vyacheslavovich Gerasimov. I thank Igor Vyacheslavovich for his feedback on the need to unify Arabic, Persian, and Pakistani names in my thesis. I support this idea, and I think the most difficult point is unification of Arab and Indo-Pakistani personal names, and in particular such a major biographer as Masoud al-Hassan prefers his name to be passed on in Latin transcription as Masudul Hassan, which obviously completely contradicts the rules of spelling names, person names in Arabic script. Another example is the Pakistani politician Ishtiaq Quraishi. His name is traditionally pronounced Ishaq, and the same forms often misspelled. A similar problem arises when trying to unify the Persian by assigning al article. I fully agree with the suggestion of Igor Vyacheslavoich to indicate in the footnotes the main information about persons referred to in the study. So that's to answer Igor Vyacheslavoich's review. I will now proceed to the review by Igor Andreevich Isayev. His first comment: as a result of analyzing context in which the term socialism is Mawdudi's work, I conclude that under this term he understood the ideology of Indian Islamic socialists, and in particular the Khalifa Ibn al-Hakim. As noted in my study, al-Hakim advocated the establishment of a social theocratic republic on the Indian subcontinent, a republic based on Islamic principles of social justice. Islamic social justice, he understood specific Islamic taxation, zakat of 2.5% of total income for the annual period. Secondly, guaranteed minimum income. And thirdly, various options for mandatory state pension. It may also be assumed that Mawdudi could have been familiar with the work of Syrian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mustafa al-Sibai, who claimed in his work, Socialism of Islam, that Islam preached a unique kind of socialism compatible with human nature on the grounds that it protected the 5 natural human rights: life, freedom, knowledge, dignity, and property. According to al-Shibaya, the exclusive role of the state is to perform social important functions, apply Islamic laws, and follow social justice. And also the under Islamic socialism. Mawdudi could understand Marx's teaching, but to this point I will come back later to this. As for the second remark, I agree with it. In my thesis, I avoided extensive related topics so as not to deviate from the main course of narration. As Igor Andreevich rightly notes, I pay little attention to history and importance of the Indian Caliphate movement for the formation of political and legal views of Mawdudi. So I can explain. Seems to me that Mawdudi and the ideologies of the Caliphate movement are united by the common idea of the need for political and spiritual unity among Muslim peoples. Like the figures of the Caliphate movement, especially Al-Jawhar and Abul Kalam Azad, Mawdudi considered the preservation of the Ottoman Caliphate a prerequisite for political unity within the Indian Muslim community itself. Let me quote one of Mawdudi's biographers, Said Valerii V. Like the activists of the Caliphate movement, those Indian Muslims who sought to preserve the institution of the Caliphate after World War I, Mawdudi's goal was to stop the decline of the Muslim Ummah and regain its right to power. In order to achieve this goal, he sought to emphasize Muslim identity and to cultivate unity and harmony in Muslims, so that the needs of Muslims would be addressed at the state level. Once achieved, the Muslim community could establish viable political structures based on Islamic cultural symbols that could support this broad movement in the current political context. Well, so this was my answer to the review by Igor Andreevich Isaev. Let me proceed. Let me remind you that we have 4 more reviews, and already time's up already. Of course, I cannot but give you the opportunity to answer the reviews, but I'm asking you. I will try to make my answers as short as possible. And as for the review by the first comment on political activities of Mawdudi, I mentioned that already. Political activities, so I will not answer this. I accept comment on the absence of critical analysis and absence of comparative analysis of political and legal doctrine of Mawdudi. And the main reason in my work, I sought to show the role and place of Mawdudi in the history of Sunni law and state doctrines, focusing mainly on his ideology and ideology of his predecessors, not his followers, successors. So the comparative analysis of his political and legal views and contemporary Islamic ideologies, in my opinion, goes beyond the scope of my research. And in addition to in addition to the authors mentioned, it would also be possible to compare Mawdudi to such ideologists such as Al-Nabhani, Surur, Al-Maghdisi, Al-Suri, Said Haba, Al-Zindani, which I considered unnecessary. So that would be superficial in my work. And as for the essence, it seems to me that Mawdudi's theory of the Islamic state is quite close to the doctrine, the civil state with Islamic orientation. As Leonid Rudolfovich says in his article, Contemporary Islamic Legal Thought on Caliphate and Civil State with an Islamic Orientation, this theory was first outlined by Al-Qardawi in his work, Religion and Politics. Al-Qardawi considers Islamic State to be not religious but civil, based on people's on the election of a ruler who's responsible for his action to the Muslim community and consults with it on the key issues. This ruler is bound in his actions by Sharia law, or, using the terminology of Mawdudi, by the divine domination or hakimaya. At the same time, direct political authority, which Mawdudi calls political dominance, is in the hands of the Muslim community. So, thus, such a state could be described as democratic, or, in Mawdudi's terminology, or theodemocratic. So, in general, terms. There are some differences between these concepts. In his doctrine on the authorities in the Islamic State, Mawdudi concentrates the entitled legislative and executive power in the hands of the emir, and unlike Al-Qaradawi, recognizes the Shura as the purely advisory body. For more information, so please see Al-Qaradawi's work, Brief Review of Mawdudi's Thought. It's published in year 2005. 2015, I beg your pardon. Next. How can I make it shorter? The question, but the use of legal terms and connection between Sharia and fiqh, I will consider this issue later, together with the question of understanding of Sharia and an understanding of fundamentalism, the point of understanding fundamentalism. As for using this term incorrectly, as in the source of Islamic source, this term, page of 9, my thesis, the term is used incorrectly. It should have been explained in more detail. I suggest I should have said teaching on the sources of fiqh. So I accept my mistake. So I don't think I can add anything here. As in the review, there was a question about my understanding of Islamic fundamentalism. As for the term fundamentalism, is quite it's quite widely discussed. As John Esposito, for example, says that the term tells us everything and at the same time nothing. So for this reason, some European researchers do not use this term in their works at all. For example, Gilles Keppel prefers the term re-Islamization, while some other authors use expressions such as radical Islam, revival, etc. So the closest Arabic term is usuliya. As for my understanding of fundamentalism, I understand it primarily in its linguistic meaning as an ideology of returning to some basics. I define Islamic fundamentalism as an ideology of religious and political movements, groups and individuals seeking to follow the principles and norms of Quran and Sunnah and the patterns of behavior of so-called righteous ancestors. In this sense, the term fundamentalist is synonymous to me with the term Salafism, and among the signs of Salafi doctrine, I distinguish the desire to follow the example of Prophet Muhammad and the four righteous caliphs, given priority to the Sunnah as a source of law, the high significance of ijtihad. Salafism in this sense should not be mixed with Wahhabism and the so-called Salafist modernism, which will be discussed below. And accordingly, when I say that Mawdudi is an intellectual forerunner of Islamic fundamentalism, I mean such a kind of Salafism as Salafi jihadism, a term used mainly by Dutch researchers and some others such as could based on the ideology of the Afghan resistance to limited presence of Soviet troops in Afghanistan, Azam al-Suri, al-Maqdisi, al-Zindani, Niyazi, Sayyaf, etc. In particular, on page 104 of my thesis, I use the term should not be translated as monotheistic, not as unity of Allah. I did not use this term in different senses. For example, on pages 2 and 4, I use it in the sense monotheistic. And next. So please remember to make it short. I will try to answer an important question about the term Sharia and the relation between Sharia and fiqh, and then I will take. But I'll try to make it short. As Leonid Rudolfovich says in his work Muslim Law, the questions of theory and practice, there's no the relation between Sharia and fiqh in modern Muslim legal science. There's at the same time we can distinguish three most typical approaches to this relationship, the modern Muslim legal science. According to the first approach, the concept of Sharia is included in the set of Sharia as a set of practical norms, including legal ones. According to the second approach, Sharia and fiqh do not correlate as a whole or a part, and Sharia itself is limited to the provisions of Quran and Sunnah. The precisely defined and understood practical prescriptions of Quran and Sunnah, while remaining a Sharia element, are included in the fiqh. And finally, according to the third position, fiqh is not an element of Sharia and at all does not coincide with it at all. Fiqh in this concept is an independent result of interpretation of ijtihad. And in my understanding of the relationship between Sharia and fiqh, I thus adhere to the second approach. Main source of reference was works of Sunni lawyers such as Abdul Karim Zaidan, Ahmad Farag Hussein, and Abul A la Mawdudi al-Sariti, who, according to quotations, will share the same opinion. And at the same, I admit it's wrong to conclude that this approach is shared by the vast majority of Sunni lawyers, as I have not studied this issue in detail. This approach to the relationship between the notions of Sharia and fiqh explains the use of such terms in my thesis as the Sharia legal norm in the meaning of ibadat and muamalat, a religious legal norm in the meaning of the general norms of Sharia, including the questions of faith and morals. Sunnah legal prescriptions in the sense of norms of Nas category of Qati. The expression application of ijtihad in the legislative activity is linked to the concept of shura in Mawdudi's doctrine of law and state, according to which shura is a practical expression of Mawdudi's principle of limited domination, and ijtihad is exercised by the legislator. As for referring to linguistic mistakes, language mistakes. I agree with this comment, except I used a number of works. Authorizer name Yusuf al-Qaradawi was spelled as Qaradawi. These were English public sources, English language sources, and I should review my approach and use other sources of reference. Valerii Vladimirovich, according to, so you have only 15 minutes, you've been speaking for 30 minutes already. I cannot deprive you of the opportunity. I cannot to answer comments. So the next review by Genevra Igorevna. The relation between Sunni and, I think I do not study the relationship between Sunni and Shia teachings in the sources of Muslim law, and I think this should be the object of a study, specific study. As for the second comment, Asabiya, the term introduced by Ibn Khaldun, has a positive meaning. This is conveys the idea of tribal solidarity, and Mawdudi understands this as a synonym of monarchy. And so this contradiction between the two concepts in the provisions set forth for defense, and so I think this influences Mawdudi's teachings about law and state. And as for the review by Sergei Fyodorovich, unfortunately, I don't know Urdu, and so unfortunately, this work is not accessible to me. But there's a number of other researchers, such as a study by Aslam Malik, published in 2001. I agree with the suggestion to go boldly beyond Islamic political and legal thought. I will take this into account in my future work. As for the combining the stages of development of Mawdudi's work on jihad and Islamic revolution, I think it's hard to define for the first, as it was emerged not before 1927, or not before second edition emerged not before 1939. And as for the comment on relation of Mawdudi's teachings and Mahatma Gandhi teaching on non-violence, should be mentioned that political practice of Mawdudi demonstrated that this teaching is the opposite to his ideology and could not be combined with his ideology. And finally, the review by Elena Vladimirovna. Thank you very much. Okay. But please make it short. I agree with the comment that is not some details are missing. So, Jihad in Islam, published in 1939 Lahore. So this fact is reflected on page 112 of my thesis. As for the question about how it was possible to how political and legal teaching in Mawdudi became possible, seems to me that it became possible due to specific socio-political conditions which existed in the Indian subcontinent in the first half of the 20th century. And secondly, it seems to me that the teaching of Mawdudi was strongly influenced by the ideology of Islam, modernism, Al-Abrani, and his ideology of pan-Islamism. So when answering your next question, the tendency is at the same time is a stage in development of Islamic political system and a consequence of particular political circumstances. And as for the question of divine domination and taken away from the idea of political domination, first of all, because the very concept of Hekimaya is a response to specific historical and political challenges of the era, such as the English colonial rule in India, politicization of Hinduism, ideological and political struggle in Egypt, abolishment of sultanate and caliphate in Turkey, socialist movements in Near and Middle East. And as for the second group of comments regard of the use of the term democracy in Mawdudi's works, I cannot agree with this comment because Mawdudi, as many as other authors, the tendency to adopt a Western political terminology, which is very obvious in his works on human rights and works on general democratic principles. And so I don't see any good reason why to say that Mawdudi attempted to make his state democratic, the essence not only in form, in essence, and not only in form. As for the possible connection between Mawdudi's teaching of Tajid and the apology of the democratic regime, this such connection with this subject of Islamic revolution, the specific political party understood as a party of Allah, and the party involved shall be involved, but not the wide population. So it doesn't make sense to talk about the general population, the wide public. So I think I will then, not to take more of your time, I will stop. I think you answered all the comments, and there's only one comment, one question to be answered. Well, thank you, and I beg your pardon. Dear colleagues, you may ask more questions to Valerii Vladimirovich. Does anyone have questions? Then, Igor Yurievich Kozlihy, academic supervisor. So could you please, Igor Yurievich, please use the microphone. I will not take much of your time. The work is good. Everyone has read it. It's obvious to anyone who has read it. Valerii knows Arabic language, which is rare. So only two, Rodolfovich and Valerii knows Arabic. Thank you to all the reviewers. Thank you to Sergei Fedorovich from faraway Kazakhstan, and to, unfortunately, Igor Andreevich is not with us, but I'd like to thank him also. And of course, I'd like to thank you, Elena Vladimirovna and Genevra Igorevna, for your excellent contribution. So brevity, as you know, is the soul of wit. So, thank you. So, well, we have to take a break for our discussion. For the time of this, the duration of this break, please stop online broadcasting. I'm also kindly asking all guests and colleagues, not members of the Dissertation Council, to leave us for a few minutes. And I will invite you to come back once our discussion is over. Dear colleagues, continue our meeting. Please resume online broadcasting and make sure we are on air, because we shall summarize our long meeting now, and thus I'm putting the issue of awarding the degree of thesis to Valerii Vladimirovich to open vote. Let me remind you that the decision of the Dissertation Council on the issue of awarding the degree is more than a half, but not less than 3 members of the Council vote for it. And let me ask the opinion of my esteemed colleagues. Leonid Rudolfovich, what's your opinion? I'm for awarding the degree of candidate of legal sciences to Pugachev Valerii Vladimirovich, specialty 120001, Theory and History of State and Law. Thank you, Leonid Rudolfovich. Sergei Fyodorovich, I am for awarding the degree of candidate of legal sciences, and I would like to congratulate Valerii Vladimirovich and his academic advisor and head of the department, Genevieva Igorevna, on producing such an excellent thesis. Genevieva Igorevna, I am for awarding a degree to Valerii Vladimirovich, candidate of legal sciences, and me also for. I'm also voting for awarding the degree of candidate of legal sciences. So we all have no other opinions. Members of the Dissertation Council unanimously voted for awarding the degree of candidate of legal sciences to Pugachev Valerii Vladimirovich. We congratulate you on awarding the degree, and we would like to give you the floor for a brief closing statement. Dear Chairman, dear members of the Council, thank you for granting me this honor. I'm very happy to present my thesis to exactly this Council, because the composition of this Council, for me, is extremely knowledgeable on all issues of political and legal teaching. So that's all I want to say. Thank you, Valerii Vladimirovich. Dear colleagues, dear Sergei Fyodorovich, Leonid Rudolfovich, we thank you for taking part in our meeting. And we, till next time, hopefully. So I declare the meeting closed now. Please stop online broadcasting. Thank you. Thank you.
Всего доброго. До свидания.